The story begins with a scene that seems almost too typical to stand out at first glance. A high-end restaurant, polished floors reflecting the ambient light, the subtle clink of fine china, and a clientele accustomed to being served without question. Among them sits a billionaire, someone whose wealth has insulated him from consequences, someone who navigates the world with the confidence that comes from a lifetime of privilege. He scans the room with a self-assured air, noting the staff with a detached amusement, seeing them not as people, but as performers in the background of his carefully curated life. When the black waitress approaches his table to take his order, he decides to assert his superiority in a way that feels clever to him. He begins speaking to her in German, a language he presumes will create a barrier, a kind of invisible wall that will place him above her in intellect and sophistication. The choice of German is deliberate, calculated. It is not just about language, but about power. He assumes that she will stumble, that she will hesitate, that his knowledge of a foreign tongue will somehow make him untouchable in a moment that is as performative as it is cruel. He smirks as he speaks, his tone laced with condescension, with the unspoken message that he can afford to mock without consequence because of who he is and where he sits. He believes that the language itself, unfamiliar to the majority of the room, shields him, making the moment private in its cruelty. In his mind, he is clever, witty, even charming in the way only someone accustomed to getting away with disrespect can be. He doesn't consider the skill, intelligence, or presence of the person standing in front of him. He doesn't pause to reflect on the fact that the waitress, though younger, though in a position he deems subordinate, has her own life, her own experiences, her own knowledge that may very well rival or surpass his assumptions about her. Instead, he acts on impulse and entitlement, treating the interaction as a game in which he expects the upper hand. Around him, other diners may notice the exchange or they may be engrossed in their own meals. But for him, the point is to assert dominance, to create a subtle but unmistakable reminder that he sees himself as superior. He miscalculates in assuming that intelligence and skill can be measured by language alone, that fluency or cultural knowledge is the property of the wealthy or of certain social classes. His mockery is not spontaneous. It is rehearsed in the mind of someone used to being in control, someone who expects compliance and deference from those around him. The restaurant setting amplifies this, a stage where manners are expected, where staff are trained to endure rudeness with grace, and where wealth often translates into unspoken power. He leans back slightly in his chair, allowing his body language to reinforce the message, confident that he has crafted the perfect little humiliation. He imagines that his words, spoken with precision and delivered with a smirk, will land exactly as intended, creating a moment where he is admired, envied, or at least unchallenged. Every gesture, every inflection, is calculated to assert his superiority. The tilt of the head, the deliberate articulation of German words, the almost theatrical expectation that she will stumble. It is an orchestrated moment designed to showcase his intelligence and cultural awareness while simultaneously highlighting what he assumes is her deficiency. In his estimation, the scene is perfectly controlled. He has manipulated language, setting, and social hierarchy to create an advantage that feels unassailable. Yet, underlying all of this is a fundamental misjudgment, one born of privilege and habit. He assumes that his familiarity with the language, his confidence, and his wealth create a shield that cannot be pierced, that the person he is mocking is incapable of responding in a way that challenges the narrative he has constructed. He underestimates not only her ability to speak German but her presence, her awareness, her ability to command respect without needing to conform to his assumptions. The moment is poised, balanced delicately between arrogance and expectation, as he watches her closely, anticipating a falter, a pause, a sign of deference that will confirm his superiority. Every part of his demeanor, his posture, his gaze, his expression, is designed to reinforce the idea that he is untouchable, that his social and economic position renders him immune to correction or contradiction, that his choice of language is an unbreachable wall, a demonstration of the divide he perceives between himself and those who serve him. It is a scene loaded with tension because it is predicated on imbalance, on the assumption that one person's skill or social standing dictates the outcome of the interaction. He does not consider the possibility that the person he is mocking might have skills, knowledge, or composure that rival or exceed his expectations. That language might not serve as a barrier, but as a tool she can wield just as effectively. His mockery, intended as an assertion of power, is rooted in a deeply ingrained belief that wealth, visibility, and social positioning equate to unchallengeable authority. He presumes that the audience, both the waitress and anyone watching, will accept the dynamic as he intends it, seeing him as clever and her as inadequate. Every calculated syllable of German he utters is meant to reinforce this narrative, to create a moment where he is not just a diner, but a symbol of dominance, a demonstration of how far privilege can extend in shaping interactions, expectations, and perceived intelligence. He is confident, assured, and entirely convinced that the power dynamic he has engineered is secure, unassailable, and complete, blind to the reality that the story has only just begun and that assumptions can be fragile, that control can be disrupted in the briefest, most unexpected of moments, and that the person he sought to demean may possess precisely the tools needed to turn the moment on its head, to reveal the cracks in his carefully constructed facade, and to demonstrate that confidence without substance is vulnerable to challenge in ways he has not anticipated. The moment she responds is immediate, precise, and entirely unshaken, a striking contrast to the smirk and expectation he had so carefully crafted. She speaks in flawless German, her words flowing naturally, without hesitation, without the slightest trace of fear or uncertainty. Every syllable she utters carries confidence and clarity, shattering the invisible wall he assumed would protect him. Her fluency is effortless, the kind of skill that comes from experience, education, and intelligence, yet it is delivered in a way that feels personal, direct, and entirely unflinching. The billionaire, who had imagined her stumbling, who had counted on hesitation or confusion, is caught entirely off guard. His smirk falters, his carefully rehearsed air of superiority cracking in the face of an unexpected reality. The shift is almost imperceptible at first, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a subtle tension in his posture, but it is unmistakable to anyone watching closely. The waitress, meanwhile, continues calmly, as though nothing unusual is happening, as though speaking another language fluently in a moment of tension is the most natural thing in the world. Her composure is remarkable not because it is defiant in an overt sense, but because it is entirely grounded, entirely natural, entirely confident. She does not raise her voice, she does not mock him in return, she does not seek revenge. She simply responds with skill, demonstrating competence and intelligence in the simplest yet most devastating way possible. Each word she speaks carries weight, and the contrast between his arrogance and her calm authority becomes almost physically tangible in the space around them. The room seems to pause in recognition of the reversal taking place, though the billionaire himself struggles to process it. He had assumed that language would be a shield, a way to maintain distance, to assert intellectual superiority, to create a private arena where he could dominate unchallenged. He had relied on the invisibility of her potential knowledge, on the assumption that she would not meet his expectations, and on the social and economic hierarchy that had always favored him. But her response dismantles all of that in an instant. It is not loud or aggressive. It is measured, precise, undeniable. There is an elegance to the way she speaks, a mastery that underscores both her personal skill and the absurdity of his presumption. His body language betrays his surprise. The smirk slips, a flicker of uncertainty crosses his face, his shoulders tense, and he hesitates as if recalibrating to understand what has just occurred. The audience, if there is one, senses it too. The subtle shift in energy, the sudden inversion of power, the instant awareness that the intended humiliation has failed spectacularly. Her response highlights the fundamental error in his assumptions. Intelligence and capability are not bound by wealth, social status, or race. The billionaire had relied on stereotypes, on an unexamined hierarchy, on the assumption that the waitress's role defined her abilities. She disproves every expectation, not through confrontation, but through mastery and calm precision. It is the kind of moment that leaves people momentarily stunned because it defies the anticipated narrative. The very tools he had used to attempt domination, language, social power, and expectation, are rendered meaningless in the face of her skill. She has turned what was intended to belittle into an unspoken demonstration of equality, competence, and dignity. The billionaire's confidence begins to falter not because she attacks him, but because she refuses to conform to the script he has written. He cannot read her as he thought he could, cannot predict her response, cannot control the narrative. Every word she speaks is a subtle reclaiming of authority, a reminder that assumptions are fragile, that confidence without substance can collapse when confronted with skill and presence. In that moment, she becomes the center of the scene, not through aggression but through calm assurance, illustrating that competence is a form of power that is independent of social status. She exposes the fragility of his arrogance by simply existing fully in her own capacity, by responding exactly as she is capable of, without apology or hesitation. The fluency of her language becomes more than communication. It is a demonstration of intellect, preparation, and awareness. Each phrase undermines the premise of his superiority. Each sentence dismantles the framework of entitlement upon which he had built his assumption of dominance. He finds himself unable to regain control of the interaction, unable to reclaim the narrative, unable to assert the authority he believed his wealth and position guaranteed. The waitress, meanwhile, continues with a quiet, unshakable command of the situation, demonstrating that the ability to respond with skill and confidence is often more powerful than any display of status or wealth. Her fluency, her poise, her precise choice of words transform the intended mockery into an exposure of his hubris, highlighting the gap between perception and reality, between assumption and actual competence, and between arrogance and true skill. The contrast between them is stark, almost cinematic, a study in expectation versus reality, in entitlement versus ability, in presumed superiority versus demonstrated competence. Her calm, fluent response forces him into a reaction he did not anticipate, a vulnerability he cannot easily disguise, and a moment of clarity for everyone witnessing the scene. The person he thought he could belittle is not only unshaken but superior in this interaction because she possesses skill, intelligence, and presence that he failed to account for. The moment the room freezes is almost instantaneous, though no one consciously decides to stop. It is a subtle, collective pause, a brief suspension of motion and sound that happens when the unexpected cuts through the ordinary. Diners mid-bite hesitate, forks hover over plates, and conversations taper off into silence as every eye shifts to the table where the exchange is unfolding. The billionaire, whose confidence had seemed unshakable just moments before, now sits rigid, the smirk that had defined his arrogance replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. The room senses it even if it cannot articulate it. The power dynamic has shifted, the expected order disrupted, and the script that everyone assumed they understood has been rewritten in real time. It is not a loud, dramatic silence. It is subtle, layered, and thick with tension, the kind of pause that communicates more than words ever could. The staff, trained to be unobtrusive yet attentive, exchange glances that reflect the collective recognition of what is happening. The waitress herself continues calmly, almost imperceptibly aware of the effect her words have had. Her fluency in German, her poised delivery, and her unwavering composure have created a ripple that reaches beyond the immediate table. The freeze is as much about the billionaire's faltering confidence as it is about the sudden admiration, respect, or shock that others feel in response. The sudden shift in energy is palpable, a reminder that the social hierarchy he assumed was fixed is, in fact, fragile and dependent on perception. The audience, whether consciously or subconsciously, begins to recalibrate their understanding of the situation. They had anticipated the billionaire's arrogance dominating the interaction, but what they are witnessing is the reversal of expectations. The freeze is not simply a reaction to her skill, but to the disruption of predictability itself. People are instinctively attuned to imbalance, to moments where control shifts unexpectedly, and this is precisely such a moment. The air in the room seems to thicken as the contrast between the two individuals becomes increasingly apparent. The billionaire's body language, once relaxed and expansive, is now constrained, almost defensive, as he struggles to process the reversal of fortune. His hands fidget subtly, his eyes dart, searching for a way to reclaim authority, yet every movement is measured against the newfound confidence displayed by the waitress. The freeze magnifies every detail, the precision of her words, the calm assurance in her posture, the faltering composure of the man who believed himself untouchable. Time itself feels to stretch, elongated by the intensity of the unexpected moment. It is a collective acknowledgement that the usual rules of interaction have been upended. Each person in the room, whether dining quietly or observing from a distance, senses that something significant is occurring. The billionaire's intended display of superiority has not only failed but has been inverted, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in a way that no amount of wealth or status can immediately remedy. The freeze also creates space for reflection, however brief, for the onlookers to recognize that assumptions about hierarchy, intelligence, and capability are often misguided. It is as if the room collectively holds its breath, waiting to see what comes next, aware that the outcome is now uncertain and that control has shifted in a manner that was previously unimaginable. The waitress's composed response serves as the catalyst for this suspended moment, her skills and confidence creating a visible and invisible shift simultaneously. Even the soundscape of the room is affected. The clatter of utensils diminishes, quiet conversations fade, and ambient noises soften as attention consolidates on the unexpected power dynamic at play. There is an almost physical tension in the air, a sensation of collective suspense that seems to hold everyone in place. Observers are drawn into the drama, not through spectacle or aggression, but through the quiet authority and competence of the person who had been underestimated. The billionaire, by contrast, becomes almost a study in dissonance. Someone who had assumed control now grapples with the realization that control was an illusion, dependent on assumptions that no longer hold. The freeze amplifies the contrast between them, between presumed dominance and demonstrated skill, between arrogance and composure. In that moment, social cues, expectations, and power hierarchies are recalibrated in real time. Even those not directly involved in the interaction become participants in the subtle shift, their perceptions altered, their attention captured, and their assumptions questioned. The room freeze is a reflection of human instinct. When expectations are defied in such a precise, visible, and undeniable way, people instinctively pause to process the change. It is a moment that captures the fragility of perceived power, the unpredictability of competence, and the deep human tendency to respond physically and mentally when confronted with a reality that contradicts long-held assumptions. In effect, the pause transforms the space itself, marking the table as a site of revelation and the interaction as a study in reversal, as an almost tangible illustration of how swiftly confidence can shift when confronted with skill, composure, and unexpected authority. Every observer, consciously or unconsciously, becomes attuned to the subtleties of the moment, the slight intake of breath, the shifting gaze, the tension in posture, and in doing so participates in the silent acknowledgement that the balance of power has been unsettled in ways that resonate far beyond the immediate interaction. The billionaire's arrogance and privilege are exposed in a way that is both immediate and undeniable, revealing the fragility of his carefully constructed self-image and the illusions he carries about power and status. He had entered the interaction with complete confidence, convinced that wealth, social standing, and his knowledge of a foreign language would shield him from challenge or embarrassment. He had relied on assumptions rooted in his experience, in the predictable ways people had responded to him throughout his life, and in the unspoken social hierarchies that he believed guaranteed his dominance. Every gesture, every smirk, every carefully chosen word was part of a performance designed to assert superiority, to remind everyone in the room, including the waitress, of his perceived intelligence and cultural sophistication. Yet, in the instant she responded fluently in German, that performance collapsed. His carefully maintained aura of control shattered because it had been built on an untested foundation, the belief that the person before him could not, match his intellect or presence. Her response dismantled that foundation completely, revealing the emptiness behind the confidence he had wielded like a weapon. The exposure of his privilege is not just about wealth. It is about the assumptions he carried, assumptions about race, social position, and capability, assumptions that allowed him to treat another human being as a subject for ridicule rather than as an equal. He believed his position allowed him to assert dominance without consequence, to expect compliance and deferential behavior as a natural response to his status. That belief, however, is entirely predicated on others accepting the narrative he projects, and in this case, that narrative is challenged in a way that is precise, undeniable, and unflinching. The contrast between his arrogance and her skill underscores the fragility of social power when it is unearned or untested. Wealth and status can create a veneer of superiority, but they do not inherently confer intelligence, competence, or resilience. Her calm and fluent response exposes the limits of his entitlement, highlighting that assumptions about others' abilities are often inaccurate and that confidence without substance is vulnerable to collapse. The exposure of his privilege is also public, played out in a space where others are aware of the reversal, whether through direct observation or through the subtle shifts in posture, expression, and tone that communicate the change. The room itself becomes a witness to the unraveling of his constructed authority, a silent jury observing the gap between perception and reality. His attempt to dominate through language and assumed cultural superiority backfires spectacularly, turning what he believed would be a moment of validation into a moment of revelation. The exposure is layered. It is about intellect, about social assumptions, about race, about the fragility of ego, and about the illusions wealth can create. It is a reminder that privilege can mask ignorance, but it cannot prevent the truth from emerging when confronted with skill, composure, and presence. In that sense, the moment serves as a kind of social commentary, a visible example of how arrogance and entitlement are often most exposed when challenged by unexpected competence. The billionaire's reaction, subtle though it may be, is telling. The smirk falters, the confidence wavers, and his body language shifts, betraying the internal recalibration required to process a reality he had not anticipated. He is forced, even momentarily, to confront the gap between his self-perception and the truth of the interaction, a gap that is made all the more stark by the poise and capability of the waitress. Privilege had given him a sense of untouchability, a belief that he could operate without accountability in social spaces where power dynamics were assumed rather than tested. Her response, however, shatters that sense, exposing the vulnerability that exists when confidence is based on assumptions rather than actual merit. The exposure is not theatrical or loud. It is quiet, precise, and undeniable. It is communicated through subtle cues, the tightening of his jaw, the blink of surprise in his eyes, the slight pause before he responds, that reveal the inner turmoil of someone confronted with the unexpected failure of their assumptions. At the same time, it is a public exposure in the sense that it is witnessed by others, who absorb the scene and process its implications. The room becomes a mirror, reflecting the discrepancy between presumed superiority and demonstrated competence, between entitlement and earned authority. Privilege, as it turns out, cannot substitute for skill or presence, and arrogance cannot shield someone from the consequences of misjudgment. The exposure also serves to highlight the social assumptions that underpin interactions in hierarchically structured environments. He had relied on a framework in which his wealth, status, and language ability would dictate the outcome. Yet that framework proves inadequate in the face of someone who possesses real competence, awareness, and confidence. In this way, the moment illuminates the often invisible ways that privilege can distort perception, inflate ego, and blind individuals to the capabilities of others. The billionaire's exposure is complete in that it reveals not only his arrogance, but the fragility of the assumptions on which it is built. It demonstrates that entitlement does not equal superiority, that wealth does not guarantee respect, and that the veneer of social dominance can be dismantled in an instant by a simple, measured act of competence and self-assuredness. Every observer in the room, whether consciously aware or not, witnesses this unraveling, sensing the recalibration of power in real time, and the realization that perceived superiority is often just a performance awaiting challenge. The audience witnesses an unexpected reversal of roles, a shift so sudden and precise that it seizes attention and transforms the dynamic in the room entirely. From the very start, the billionaire had positioned himself as the one in control, confident that his wealth, social status, and command of language would establish a hierarchy where he was untouchable. Every gesture he made, every word he spoke, was designed to reinforce that assumed dominance, to subtly remind those present of the gulf he believed existed between his world and that of the waitress standing before him. The audience, whether diners nearby or onlookers at adjacent tables, had likely anticipated a familiar narrative, someone accustomed to privilege asserting superiority over someone expected to be deferential. They expected a predictable interaction, a performance of hierarchy that would reinforce the social structures they were conditioned to accept. What happens instead shatters those expectations in an instant. The waitress responds fluently, confidently, and without hesitation, in the very language meant to serve as a barrier. Her command of German is impeccable, each word deliberate and precise, delivered in a calm and composed manner that leaves no room for doubt about her ability or presence. The audience observes this exchange and experiences the shift collectively, almost physically. The confidence and assuredness with which she speaks disrupt the billionaire's assumed authority, creating a palpable tension in the air. Every eye in the room is drawn to the scene, tracking the subtle changes in posture, facial expression, and tone. The billionaire, who had expected deference, now shows subtle signs of discomfort, a momentary falter in his smile, a tightening of his jaw, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. These small cues are magnified by the audience's perception, emphasizing the reversal of roles and highlighting the fragility of his arrogance. In witnessing this, the audience not only sees a personal triumph, but also participates in the broader social commentary embedded in the moment. They are confronted with a real-time demonstration that assumptions based on privilege, status, or superficial markers of intelligence can be entirely misleading. The roles they had unconsciously assigned are upended, and they are forced to recalibrate their perception of authority, competence, and power. This reversal resonates because it is so unexpected, yet so precise. The billionaire had relied on the presumption that he could control the interaction, that his position would dictate the outcome, and that his mockery would go unchallenged. The audience sees the collapse of this presumption as a lesson in humility, an illustration of how easily perceived power can be disrupted when it is built on assumptions rather than merit. Observers may notice subtle changes in the social atmosphere. Whispers die down, heads turn, conversations pause, and attention converges on the table where the exchange is occurring. The reversal is amplified by its context. This is not a staged confrontation, not a prearranged performance. It is spontaneous, authentic, and rooted in genuine skill and composure. The audience witnesses, in real time, the dismantling of a hierarchy that had seemed unshakable, and that witnessing carries its own weight and meaning. It is instructive, almost didactic, in demonstrating that competence, intelligence, and self-assurance do not conform to social expectations or assumptions. The power of the moment lies in its subtlety. The waitress does not need to raise her voice, issue a challenge, or humiliate the billionaire in return. Her role reversal is enacted simply through skill, calmness, and presence. The audience recognizes this as a form of quiet authority, a display of competence that communicates more forcefully than any argument or confrontation could. The reversal of roles is also significant because it highlights the performative nature of perceived superiority. The billionaire's confidence had been contingent on the audience's acceptance of his narrative, on the assumption that the hierarchy he projected would be internalized by those observing. The waitress's fluent response disrupts that performative script, exposing the vulnerability inherent in relying on status rather than skill. The audience witnesses the tension between expectation and reality, between projected dominance and actual authority. Each reaction, subtle or overt, from the billionaire and the waitress, is magnified by the presence of observers who absorb and interpret every nuance. The reversal is not limited to the two people directly involved. It ripples outward, affecting perceptions of social dynamics, reinforcing the unpredictability of human interaction and highlighting the importance of skill and presence over inherited or assumed status. In watching this, the audience becomes complicit in the recognition of a moment where social assumptions fail, where predicted hierarchies are overturned, and where an individual's true capabilities shine in a way that cannot be denied. The shift is dramatic precisely because it is understated, a quiet yet undeniable recalibration of authority that draws attention, prompts reflection, and leaves an impression far more lasting than any overt display of aggression or confrontation could. Observers are forced to witness not only the immediate reversal but the broader implications, the unpredictability of social interaction, the fallibility of assumptions, and the power of competence and confidence to challenge and redefine roles in real time. Every glance, every gesture, every microexpression contributes to the audience's understanding that what they are seeing is more than a personal interaction. It is a demonstration of how skill, awareness, and self-assuredness can invert expectations, disrupt hierarchies, and redefine authority in ways that resonate beyond the moment itself. The moment highlights respect, skill, and human dignity in a way that is both immediate and profoundly visible, demonstrating that true authority and influence are not dictated by wealth, status, or assumed superiority, but by the capacity to act with competence, composure, and self-assurance. From the outset, the interaction is framed by a stark imbalance. The billionaire assumes a position of power based on social and economic privilege, using language as a tool to belittle and assert control. He expects compliance, hesitation, and subservience, believing that his wealth and status grant him immunity from challenge or scrutiny. Yet, in responding fluently and confidently in German, the waitress not only rejects his attempt at dominance, but reasserts her own presence in a manner that is calm, precise, and entirely dignified. Her response demonstrates that respect is not granted based on preconceptions or societal hierarchies, but is earned and reinforced through skill, awareness, and the capacity to meet challenges with poise. The human dignity she embodies in this exchange becomes apparent not through confrontation or aggression, but through mastery and authenticity. She does not seek to humiliate in return, she does not attempt to undermine for spectacle, and she does not allow the billionaire's mockery to dictate her behavior. Instead, she embodies the principles of self-respect and professional excellence, proving that human dignity is maintained not by reacting to disrespect with hostility, but by responding with competence and calm authority. Observers are able to witness, almost viscerally, the way that skill and dignity can neutralize arrogance and entitlement. The billionaire, who had relied on assumptions and social privilege to assert control, is left exposed because his authority was performative, dependent on the expectation that others would conform to his narrative. The waitress, by contrast, demonstrates that true influence arises from capability and presence rather than inherited or imposed status. The contrast between them emphasizes the values that underpin human dignity: respect for oneself, respect for one's work, and respect for the unspoken rules of fairness and competence. Her fluency is more than a display of language ability. It is a manifestation of preparation, intelligence, and lived experience, each contributing to the sense that she commands respect not through intimidation, but through demonstrated skill. The audience, whether directly involved or observing from a distance, recognizes this inversion of expectations. They see arrogance confronted not with anger, but with mastery. They see entitlement undermined not through loud confrontation, but through quiet, undeniable competence. This moment crystallizes the idea that human dignity is inherently resilient and can withstand attempts at belittlement when it is grounded in self-assurance and expertise. Furthermore, the exchange underscores the principle that skill is a powerful equalizer in social interactions. No matter the disparity in wealth or status, an individual's knowledge, competence, and ability to communicate effectively can shift dynamics and command attention and respect. The waitress's calm, fluent response is not performative. It is a natural assertion of ability, and in doing so, it reveals the fragility of power built solely on privilege and assumption. Her dignity amplifies her skill, and her skill reinforces her dignity, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that leaves the billionaire's arrogance exposed and the audience aware of the deeper truths at play. The scene also serves as a reminder of the social responsibility that accompanies competence. The waitress uses her skill not to dominate or belittle, but to assert herself with integrity, maintaining composure while exposing the limitations of the man attempting to mock her. In doing so, she illustrates that respect is intertwined with ethical conduct, that authority without empathy or awareness is hollow, and that true influence arises from the capacity to act with competence, fairness, and self-possession. The audience witnesses more than a reversal of social roles. They witness an affirmation of values that transcend social and economic hierarchies. Skill, poise, and dignity emerge as forms of power that cannot be bought or feigned, and they demonstrate that respect is both a right and a responsibility, earned through action rather than assumed through circumstance. Each word she speaks, each gesture she makes, reinforces the principle that human dignity is not contingent on others' perceptions, but on the consistency with which an individual upholds their own standards of professionalism, respect, and capability. The interplay between competence and dignity becomes the defining feature of the moment, highlighting that those who rely on privilege alone may find their authority fragile and their assumptions exposed when confronted with someone who possesses both skill and self-respect. Observers are drawn into this realization, recognizing that the waitress's calm fluency is a direct counterpoint to the billionaire's arrogance and a clear illustration of how human dignity manifests through action, presence, and mastery. The contrast serves as a social lesson. That competence is not merely functional but transformative, capable of recalibrating perceptions, demanding attention, and asserting moral and professional authority in situations where power dynamics are otherwise assumed to be fixed. In this way, the moment emphasizes that human dignity is inseparable from skill and respect. It is lived through decisions, communication, and the refusal to allow one's value to be dictated by the presumptions or entitlement of others. The audience sees, without question, that competence and self-assuredness command acknowledgement and reshape interaction, even against seemingly insurmountable disparities in wealth and status.